Something strange is going on in the world of gaming right now, and you need to pay close attention because this story is bigger than it seems at first. Crimson Desert just came out, and it quickly became one of the most talked about action RPGs in a long time. Pearl Abyss gave us something truly amazing, a huge open world, smooth combat, and stunning graphics. This game is so good that you forget you were supposed to go to bed 2 hours ago. Early technical problems were quickly fixed, review scores went up, and gamers voted with their wallets and wish lists. So of course, as soon as a game starts to do well on that level, some people start looking for a new angle. Not from a technical point of view, not a gameplay point of view. Another thing. Something that is right. Something that, if you frame it just right, makes you the center of a conversation you weren't originally a part of. And that's what happened. A famous person from gaming history who directed one of the best action games of all time, saw Crimson Desert, played it, said he loved it, and then posted something online that set the gaming world on fire. But here's the crazy part about this story. People on the internet didn't just disagree with him. People on the internet all said that his post said a lot more about him than it did about the game. What did he see? What did he say? And why do tens of thousands of players think he accidentally showed his bias without even knowing it? David Jaffe is the man at the center of this. You know that name if you've been playing games for more than 10 years. The director of the first God of War, the person who made Twisted Metal, a man with real, undeniable, and legendary credits to his name. In his own words, Jaffe said on social media that Crimson Desert has what he called anti-Semitic content, or at least content that feels as such. Before we talk about whether he's right or wrong, let's go over what he said in detail, because the details are very important here. There is a trading group in the game called the Goldleaf Trading Post. Jaffe says that the name Goldleaf is close enough to a Jewish last name, like Goldberg, to be a deliberate coded reference. He said, and this is a paraphrase to avoid direct reproduction, the name could just as well be a last name like Goldberg. Second, this group has a goblin character that goes with it. Jaffe pointed out that the character's physical design, especially the nose, is similar to visual tropes that have been used in the past to spread propaganda against Jews. Third, this character has a mission in the game. The name of that mission is the Flames of Greed. Jaffe says that putting a goblin with a mission about greed in a guild with a name that has to do with gold sends a clear message that something bad is going on. Jaffe made it clear that he still likes the game. He said he understands why the developers made the creative choices they did, but he said that he doesn't like it, and that these things are examples of a pattern of stereotyping that has its roots in anti-Semitism in the past. He later went on a live stream on YouTube to explain more. He said that he thinks of himself as culturally Jewish because he grew up in a Jewish home. He also said that this background makes him more aware of how these kinds of visual tropes have become part of culture over the years. So much so that the Korean developers at Pearl Abyss may not have even been aware of how important those design choices are in history. That is the whole accusation. Now let's talk about why hundreds of thousands of people think the response to it was more revealing than the accusation itself. This is the part of the story that really gets interesting. As soon as Jaffe's second post went up, people started to respond. And the most common response from people of all political stripes, from both sides of the gaming culture debate, and from players in the West and the East, was not to defend Pearl Abyss on technical grounds. This was basically the most common response. You just saw a fantasy creature, and the first thing that came to mind was a certain ethnic group in the real world. And you think the developers are the problem? Think about what that argument really means. If you see a big-nosed goblin running a merchant guild, and your mind immediately goes to Jewish people, who is doing the stereotyping? Did the Korean game developers make a fantasy creature to live in a fantasy economy? Or is it the person whose mind is so set on a certain biased connection that they can't see a pointed nose on a made-up creature without thinking of a whole ethnic and religious group? People on NeoGAF, Reddit, and social media have been calling this the self-report. The argument is that the accusation itself shows the kind of reductive association that it says it is calling out. A widely shared comment made the point very clearly. If you see an ugly fantasy goblin and immediately think of Jewish people, you are the one who is making that connection. The people who made the game drew a fantasy creature. You drew the line to a real group of people. That's your fault. In his live stream, Jaffe now directly addressed this counter-argument. He pushed back by saying that this is a common way to avoid the issue, that recognizing anti-Semitic images in pop culture does not mean you are prejudiced against Jews, and that calling the concern "you're the real racist" is a dishonest way to make a point. And to be honest, that's a good point to make in general. Recognizing the historical origins of a detrimental symbol does not equate to endorsing it. A historian who looks at Nazi propaganda is not supporting Nazism. But this is where the counter-argument gets more complicated, and the specifics of this case are very important here. This is not the first time this talk has taken place, not even close. For years, a group of cultural critics has looked at fantasy books and games through the same lens, saying that the visual and behavioral stereotypes associated with orcs, goblins, and other similar creatures in mainstream fantasy have hidden racial or ethnic meanings. The most well-known version of this argument is about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Over the years, many critics have said that the Orcs, who are brutal, dark-skinned, and savage, and want to destroy everything, are a coded way of showing non-white people. People have said this about Peter Jackson's movie adaptations, the Amazon Prime series, and the books themselves. Most people who like Tolkien think this reading is not only wrong, but also rude. The argument is that you are the one who connects dark skin with evil and violence. That wasn't what Tolkien said. You made that link yourself. And here's the important detail that Tolkien scholars always bring up. Tolkien's dwarves, who are widely seen as his most Jewish-coded group, are shown as brave, skilled, noble, culturally rich, and very sympathetic. Some of the rules of their language were based on Hebrew grammar. Their cultural diaspora reflects the historical experiences of Jews. Tolkien himself said good things about this connection. So in the same made-up world, there is a group that has traits from Jewish culture and is the good guys, the craftsmen, and the bearers of culture. The Harry Potter series has also been accused of having goblin bankers at Gringotts who have hook noses, are obsessed with gold, and run the magical world's banks. The argument was strong enough to start a real cultural debate, especially when Hogwarts Legacy came out a few years ago. What does all of this mean? It shows us that you can find these connections almost anywhere if you use a certain way of looking at fantasy world building. For hundreds of years, European folklore has shown goblins as greedy, sly, and physically exaggerated creatures. In the fantasy genre, that's just what goblins are. When you think that every hook-nosed fictional character with business traits is a secret anti-Semitic symbol, you have made the whole genre look bad. Critics say that this is where the lens itself becomes a problem. You will find what you are looking for everywhere you look because you are filtering everything through the idea that it must be there. This is the specific thing about Crimson Desert that Jaffe's critics keep bringing up, and it really is important. Shaka 2 is the name of the goblin character that Jaffe talked about. He is connected to the Gold Leaf Trading Post and the Flames of Greed mission, and this is what Jaffe may not have known or said when he made his claim. In this game, Shakatu is not a bad guy. He is not the personification of greed. You shouldn't hate, fear, or see him as a symbol of something bad. You actually help Shakatu. The mission is to kill a corrupt guildmaster who is taking advantage of other people. Shakatu is on the right side of that fight. By any standard of narrative framing, he is a good actor in the story. So let's think about what this means for what Jaffe said. The claim was that the goblin character, the gold-themed names, and the mission called Greed all add up to an anti-Semitic composite. But that reading means you have to look at those three things separately. A screenshot, a mission name, and a character design. You can't think about what the character does, what role he plays, or what the story says about him. Why is this goblin the one who helps you fight the corrupt guildmaster if the game wants to use him as an anti-Semitic symbol of greed and corruption? Why is he portrayed as someone you help, someone who fights against exploitation, and someone who is ultimately seen in a good light in the story? The most obvious answer is that Perlibus was making a fantasy world with fantasy characters. They gave one of those characters a name and a job without meaning to give them any real-world ethnic coding. This is what happens when you make a judgment based on a screenshot instead of playing the content in its original setting. The tweet about greed and the guild with a gold theme looks bad. Once you know that the character is helping you get rid of the corruption that word means, it looks a lot less bad. In his live stream, Jaffe himself said that he thought the Korean developers might not know about the historical connections. He gave them that much grace. But his critics say that if you think it was unintentional, then the accusation of anti-Semitism, even if you say it feels as such, is still hurting the studio's reputation a lot because it was a mistake. Now let's take a step back and ask a question that a lot of people in these comments and on these forums have been asking. What is David Jaffe doing? That is not an attack on rhetoric. This is a real, important question that needs to be looked at honestly. For a long time, Jaffe hasn't been at the center of the gaming industry's biggest talks. It's been more than 10 years since his last major credited work as a developer. A different creative team has since rebooted and reimagined the God of War franchise that he helped create, turning it into one of the most popular series in modern gaming. He didn't want the franchise to go in the direction it did, with the father-son story, the Norse mythology, and the emotional depth. It was Cory Barlog's. Jaffe has spent a lot of time over the past few years building up his social media and YouTube presence by reacting to gaming news, sharing his thoughts on industry trends, and sometimes sharing strong opinions that get people talking. And here's the awkward part. The kind of post he made about Crimson Desert is sure to get people talking. A famous game developer says a big new game is anti-Semitic. That is a story. It goes around. It gets covered. It puts his name next to one of the year's most talked about releases in the news. Is that a cynical thing to say? Maybe. Is it right? Not clear. But here's what a lot of people have said, and it's really worth thinking about. Jaffe said he loves the game. He said that he is still playing it. He said that Pearl Abyss has the right to make the creative choices they did. Would someone keep playing a game for fun if they really really, truly believed that it had hateful content based on hundreds of years of anti-Semitic propaganda that was meant to dehumanize a whole religious and ethnic group? Would you keep watching a movie that you thought was racist because the cinematography was good? A lot of people find it hard to understand Jaffe's position because it has an internal contradiction. I love this game, I'm still playing it, but it has anti-Semitic content. If the accusation is serious, the actions don't fit. If the behavior is honest, the accusation might not be as bad as it seems. A lot of people think this was less of a moral stand and more of a way to get people involved because of that disconnect. You can decide for yourself if that reading is fair. This controversy fits perfectly into a larger picture, and I think it's worth naming directly. There is more and more tension in the gaming industry between two different ideas about how to design games and be responsible for culture. On one side, there are Eastern studios, mostly Korean, Japanese, and Chinese developers, who mostly want to make games that are technically advanced, mechanically complex, and visually stunning. They are making up worlds with made-up creatures, made-up economies, and made-up wars. In general, they are not following a list of things that are sensitive in Western culture. They aren't hiring diversity experts to look over their goblin designs. They are making games the same way they always have, for the love of the craft, to keep players interested and to make money. On the other side, a large part of the Western gaming establishment, including critics, journalists, and some veteran developers, has been saying for the past 10 years that all media, including fantasy games, should be looked at in light of real-world social and political frameworks. In this view, a goblin with a big nose and a quest about money is more than just a goblin. It could be a carrier of harmful historical ideas, and creators need to know this and work around it. At a fundamental level, these two views are not compatible. And the fact that Pearl Abyss, a Korean studio, wasn't working within the second framework is what makes Crimson Desert such a flashpoint. They probably didn't even know they were supposed to be. The gaming community's response has been very helpful. The ratio of views to likes on Jaffe's post, hundreds of thousands of views and only a small number of likes, tells us where the real gaming audience stands on this issue. Not only in terms of this specific accusation, but also in terms of the bigger question of whether they want their fantasy games to be seen through this kind of political and historical lens. A commenter from Asia in one of these threads made a point that cut through a lot of the noise. For most people in Asia, the idea of a goblin or dwarf in a fantasy game making them think of a real-life ethnic group right away just doesn't happen. It's not a lack of education or empathy. The lack of a specific Western cultural framework is what makes that connection seem automatic. Pearl Abyss was making creatures for a made-up world. The Western way of looking at things that turns those creatures into ethnic symbols just wasn't part of their creative setting. Is that a problem? That is really up for debate. But it's important to remember that what seems like an obvious and offensive symbol in one culture may not be seen that way at all in another. That doesn't mean that intent is the only thing that counts, but it does mean that it's a big leap to think that someone did it on purpose. Let's take a moment to talk about the specific linguistic claim that Jaffe made. People in the comments of these threads have talked about it directly, and the response is worth hearing. Jaffe said that the name Goldleaf is similar enough to a last name like Goldberg to be used as a coded reference. This means that someone at Pearl Abyss picked a name for the trading guild that has to do with gold because it sounds like a Jewish last name. This is the problem with that argument. The name Goldberg comes from both German and Yiddish. It means gold mountain in a loose sense. It is a last name that many Ashkenazi Jewish families in Central and Eastern Europe used during a time in history when Jews had to use Germanic last names. They often chose them based on natural features like mountains, fields, and rivers. The word gold in Goldberg is not a Jewish word. It is a word from Germany. It appears in hundreds of last names from non-Jewish Germans and Scandinavians. There are hundreds of mountains, rivers, towns, and landmarks in Europe that have nothing to do with Jewish culture. When a Korean fantasy game developer names a trading group after valuable things like Goldleaf, they are doing what all fantasy game developers do. They are giving a business name that sounds like it sells valuable things, because it does. To believe that this is a coded anti-Semitic signal, you would have to think that anyone who names a made-up merchant guild after a valuable material is secretly using Jewish names. By that standard, Silverhand, Ironforge, Coppercrest, and pretty much every other guild name in the history of fantasy games is suspicious. A trading company with a name that has to do with gold is exactly what it looks like at some point. I want to zoom all the way out here because I think the most important thing to take away from this whole mess is something that goes beyond Crimson Desert, David Jaffe, and Goblins. Right now, the urge to find harmful meaning in cultural products has gotten so strong and automatic in some groups that it is making more noise than signal. The filter is so sensitive now that it picks up on things that were never meant to be signals. The irony at the heart of the Jaffe story is that the post itself may have been the most anti-Semitic part of it. This is not a rhetorical trick. It is a real irony. The automatic connection between a hook-nosed fictional creature and Jewish people does not mean you know what anti-Semitism is. It means that you have taken in, at least on some level, the same visual shorthand that anti-Semitic propaganda from the past used. When you see a crooked nose, you think of a certain race. That's how the propaganda works. That is the dehumanizing association working on your subconscious mind, no matter which side of the accusation you are on. This is what Jaffe's critics mean when they say the quiet part out loud. His post showed that he had his own biases. They're not calling him anti-Semitic. They're saying that his way of thinking about fantasy creatures is already so full of that connection that he can't help but make the connection that the propaganda was meant to make. And in the meantime, the millions of players who see a goblin and think, that's a goblin, this is a game, and I wonder what loot it drops, are probably doing something better for their mental health. They are interacting with fantasy on its own terms. That's what a growing number of gamers are against. Not the past, not the scholarship, not the real research that looks at these tropes in European folklore over the years, but the insistence that every player in every game must always be running that interpretive subroutine in the background, that enjoying a fantasy game without putting every creature design in the context of historical propaganda is a moral failure. Crimson Desert is a game set in a made-up world. Shikatu is a made-up person who helps you fight made-up evil. In a world full of fantasy groups with names that have to do with gold, the Gold Leaf Trading Post is a fantasy merchant group. And from what we know, very few people who played the game experienced the story and thought that Pearl Abyss was trying to make them hate Jewish people. The ratio tells that story. The post was seen by hundreds of thousands of people. Most of them did not agree. What do you think? Does Jaffe have a point that we should take more seriously? Or is this a filter that is so finely tuned that it starts to pick up signals and noise? See you in the next one.